What scientists do. A scientist is a person who wonders why. Most scientific discoveries start when a person asks a question. Why do objects fall when we drop them? How can some animals live underwater? What is beyond the stars? The answers to these questions and many more were all discovered because people wondered why. The process of finding answers to scientific questions is called scientific inquiry. It involves many different steps. The first step is to make an observation. The second step is to ask a question that comes to mind as a result of making the observation. The third step is to come up with an idea that might answer your question. This idea is called a hypothesis. For example, after a few weeks without rain, you might observe that the plants in your garden are dying. This leads you to come up with the question, why are the plants dying? Your hypothesis might be plants need water to live. You would base your hypothesis on your own observations and on what you already know about the world. The fourth step is to test your hypothesis by conducting an experiment. Just watching the plants in your garden usually does not give you enough information to find out if your hypothesis is correct. There are many other conditions besides rainfall that might affect your plants. For example, they might be getting too much or too little sunlight. The temperature might be too hot or too cold. They could be planted in different types of soil. These factors and conditions that can change and might affect the experiment are called variables. To conduct a fair experiment, you must control all of the variables except for the one you are testing. Therefore, you would need a minimum of 2 identical plants for such an experiment. A better experiment could be conducted with 2 identical sets of plants that contained 5 plants each. You would have to expose both sets of plants to the same amount of sunlight. You'd have to keep them at the same temperature. The only variable in your care for these plants would be in the watering. You would water one set of plants once a day for 2 weeks. You would not water the other set of plants at all. After you completed your experiment, you would observe the results. In the example above, the plants that were not watered would die. The other plants would live. This would tell you that plants need water to live. Your idea has now been tested. Sometimes the scientist's hypothesis turns out to be wrong. The scientist might conduct several experiments to test the hypothesis, only to discover that the results don't support it. But this does not mean the scientist has failed. The scientist still learns something by conducting the experiments and making further observations. These observations often lead to new questions, new hypotheses, new experiments, and new knowledge. Demonstrating that a plant needs water to live is easy. But how do scientists develop explanations for events that happen far out in space? How do they look at organisms, objects, and systems that are too small to see? How do they organize the results of their experiments? Scientists use instruments to help them make observations, conduct experiments, and organize data or information. Some instruments help us see things that are very tiny. These include magnifying lenses and microscopes. Other instruments show us things that are far away. These include telescopes and satellites. Instruments such as thermometers and barometers provide precise data about temperature and weather conditions. Computers help scientists to organize and analyze the data and get results much faster than any human brain can. All these instruments help scientists find answers to questions. An important part of scientific inquiry is to make the results of experiments known to the public. Scientists write articles about their experiments and what they think they've proved. These articles are published in scientific journals. Some scientific journals are magazines mostly for scientists, and others are for the general public. It is important that a scientist explain exactly how he or she conducted experiments. That allows other scientists to repeat the experiments to see if they get the same results. If they do, they will probably agree that the first scientist's ideas are correct. But sometimes other scientists do not get the same results. They may conclude that the first scientist did something wrong or that there is another explanation for the results of the original experiment. Having scientists review and ask questions about each other's work is an important step in scientific inquiry. Scientists gathering information in the field. Sir Isaac Newton, learning through experimenting. Many people consider Sir Isaac Newton to be one of the greatest scientists that ever lived. His work changed how people thought about light, gravity, and space. Newton was born on a sheep farm 160 kilometers or 100 miles north of London. Most people did not go to school for more than a few years in those days, but Newton's teachers were very impressed with him. They encouraged his mother to send him to Cambridge, one of England's greatest universities. After he finished his studies, Newton stayed on at Cambridge as a mathematics professor. Along with teaching, he conducted many experiments to answer questions he had about the world around him. One of Newton's most famous discoveries was that light is made up of colors. Scientists in Newton's day were familiar with prisms. A prism is a clear piece of glass that breaks up light into the colors of the rainbow. But these scientists did not believe that light was actually made up of different colors. They believed that prisms changed light by making it darker. If white light became a little darker, it turned red, orange, or yellow. If it became a lot darker, the light looked green, blue, or violet. Newton didn't believe this. He thought that the prism did not change light, it simply revealed what light was made of. His hypothesis was that sunlight was a mixture of different colors. Each of these colors was bent differently when it shone through a prism. Because the prism bent the light in different directions, the separate colors could be seen. Newton conducted an experiment to see if he was right. He cut a small hole in a window shade hanging in his room. When the sunlight shone through the hole, it made a 5 centimeter, 2-inch image on the opposite wall. Next, Newton placed a prism between the window and the wall. If all the light passing through the prism bent at the same angle, the image on the wall would be the same size. Instead, The image was now over 25 centimeters or 10 inches long. And as Newton expected, the image was no longer white. It was violet at the top and red at the bottom, with a range of other colors in between. Newton thought of a name for the colorful image he got by passing light through a prism. He called it a spectrum. Oddly enough, Newton's eyesight was not good. His assistant had to help him identify the rainbow of colors he created. At first, other scientists did not believe that white light was made up of different colors. In fact, Newton spent a great deal of time defending his results to other scientists. This annoyed Newton very much. But as the other scientists tried Newton's experiments, it became clear that his ideas about light were correct. Newton's famous experiment. Jane Goodall, learning through observation. From the time she was a child, Jane Goodall loved animals. Born in the English countryside, she was happiest when she was outside with the horses, chickens, and other animals on the farm where she lived. Goodall read books about animals from other parts of the world. When she grew up, she wanted to study animals in the faraway land of Africa. Goodall made her first trip to Africa in 1957, when she was 23 years old. While she was there, she met a famous scientist named Dr. Louis Leakey. Dr. Leakey was a paleontologist. Paleontologists study animals, plants, and people who lived millions of years ago. Leakey gave Goodall a job as his secretary. He then invited her to go on an archaeological dig in Tanzania, a country in eastern Africa. On the trip, Dr. Leakey told Goodall about some chimpanzees in the jungles of Tanzania. He wanted someone to study these animals and observe how they behaved. He thought those observations could be used to answer questions about human behavior. Would Goodall like the job? Goodall was thrilled at Leakey's offer. She started her observations in June 1960 in Tanzania's Gombe Stream Chimpanzee Reserve. At first, the chimps refused to come out of the trees when they saw Goodall. She had to watch them through binoculars. It was hard for her to see well through the thick leaves and branches. Although Goodall was discouraged, she did not lose her patience. After a few months, the chimpanzees began to accept her. They came out in the open and allowed her to watch them. Eventually, they became very trusting. They would come right up to Goodall and allow her to groom them. It was a sign of respect and affection. Goodall became the first human to observe how chimpanzees raise their young in the wild. She spent her days and nights in the open, watching the chimpanzees. She believed that the only way to find out how an animal really lives and behaves is to observe it in its natural environment over a long period of time. One day, Goodall saw a chimpanzee poke a long blade of grass into a termite mound. He ate the insects that clung to the grass when he pulled it out. Later, she saw some chimpanzees pulling leaves off a stick to make a termite catching tool. This was a startling discovery. Up until then, scientists knew that many animals use tools, but they had thought only humans could create tools. Jane Goodall has earned the trust of chimps. Goodall's observations provided first-hand knowledge of chimpanzee society and behavior. She taught humans a great deal about these amazing animals. Goodall is still working with chimpanzees. She says there is so much to learn that she will never stop discovering new things about them. Jane Goodall's work shows how important observation is to scientific inquiry. By going into the wild and observing the chimpanzees in their natural habitat, she was able to learn things about them that no other scientist had known before. Questions to explore. What are the steps involved in scientific inquiry? What is a variable? What is important to remember when you conduct a controlled experiment? Toy ducks at sea. An accident in the Pacific Ocean led to an unusual opportunity for scientists who study ocean and wind currents. A storm struck a cargo ship sailing from Hong Kong to Tacoma, Washington on January 10, 1992. It washed a container containing 29,000 bathtub toys overboard south of the Aleutian Islands. Soon plastic turtles, frogs, ducks, and beavers began washing up on Alaskan beaches. Scientists at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, took advantage of this opportunity. A group of oceanographers, scientists who study the ocean, began to track the toys' journeys around the Pacific. At first, scientists followed reports from beaches where a lot of the toys washed up. Then they actively went out and searched for the toys themselves. They made charts showing where and when some toys landed. These observations gave them first-hand information about wind and ocean currents. Scientists hope to use this information to track oil spills and discover where schools of fish travel. The oceanographers learned some surprising things. Jim Ingram, a scientist at NOAA, says that scientists thought it would take 4 to 6 years for the toys to make a complete circuit of the northern Pacific. Instead, it took just 2.5 years. That might mean that ocean and wind currents are stronger than scientists thought. Scientists also noted that the toys traveled in a counterclockwise manner. Even though the ducks completed their circuit of the northern Pacific, many of them are still out there. Ingram wouldn't be surprised if some of the toys became trapped in northward moving ice at the North Pole. These might float all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. If that happens, scientists will have a whole new ocean to explore, all thanks to a carton of shipwrecked toys.